Today, we are diving into a book that really just blew up how we think about science itself. It's Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And his big idea that science doesn't just move forward in a straight line, but through these huge, world-changing upheavals. So let's start with a big question Kuhn was trying to answer. We have this idea, right, that science is this steady, noble march towards the absolute truth. Each generation adds another brick to this giant wall of knowledge, but Kuhn looked at the actual history of science and thought, hang on, that's not what happened at all. The real story is way more dramatic and a lot messier. And this slide right here gets to the heart of it. On the left, you've got that classic story they teach you in school. Science is cumulative. One discovery builds on the last, Newton figures out gravity, and Einstein comes along and just adds a few tweaks. But Kuhn, on the right, he proposed something totally different. He saw a cycle, long, stable periods of science followed by these violent revolutions that just shatter the old way of thinking completely. Okay, so to really get what Kuhn is saying, we first have to take apart what he called the myth of how science works. You see, Kuhn started out as a physicist, but when he started studying the history of science, he got a huge shock. He realized that textbooks tell this really neat and tidy story. They make it seem like all the scientists of the past were just working their way toward what we know now. It makes the whole thing look like this simple, inevitable path right to our doorstep. And this was the key for Kuhn. That whole linear story, it's wrong. He said progress isn't just about piling up more and more facts. Instead, he argued that for long stretches of time, science operates inside this kind of intellectual bubble, a shared framework that basically dictates everything. And that brings us to his most famous idea. And that famous idea is the concept of the paradigm. It's the framework that defines what science even means for a group of scientists at a particular time. So what is a paradigm? Well, it's way more than just a theory. It's an entire worldview. It includes the classic experiments, the accepted laws, all the shared assumptions. Think about Newtonian physics, or way back Ptolemy's idea that the Earth was the center of the universe. These paradigms don't just explain the world, they tell scientists what questions are even worth asking and what tools are legit for answering them. So, most scientists, for most of their careers, are doing what Kuhn called normal science. This is not about having some giant eureka moment. It's much more like puzzle solving. The paradigm gives you the rules of the game and the picture on the front of the puzzle box. The scientist's job is just to fill in the missing pieces, make a measurement a little more precise, clear up a small inconsistency. The key thing here is they are explicitly not trying to break the mold. But what happens when a piece of the puzzle just won't fit? No matter how you turn it, no matter how hard you try to jam it in, it just doesn't belong. That's when the whole foundation of normal science starts to crack. And this is Kuhn's cycle in a nutshell. You start with that normal, everyday, puzzle-solving science. But then an anomaly pops up, a result that the current paradigm just can't explain. And if that anomaly sticks around, it triggers a crisis. And that crisis can only be solved by a full-blown revolution. So an anomaly is basically a really stubborn puzzle. For example, for decades, the orbit of the planet Mercury was just a little bit off from what Newton's laws predicted. At first, scientists figured it's a measurement error or maybe there's another planet we haven't found yet. They tried everything they could think of to solve this puzzle within the rules of the Newtonian paradigm because, that's what normal science is all about. But when weird results like this refuse to go away and then maybe more crop up, a sense of crisis starts to set in. The faith in the old paradigm, the one that worked so well for so long, starts to shake. The rules get a little looser. Scientists start proposing crazier, more out-of-the-box ideas because it's starting to look like the box itself is broken. This quote from the brilliant physicist Wolfgang Pauli just perfectly captures that feeling of a scientific crisis. He wrote this right before the quantum revolution. The old physics was failing, but the new one hadn't been born yet. And it was this time of total confusion and even professional despair. It must have felt like the very ground beneath their feet was disappearing. So, a crisis can really only end in one of two ways. Either the old paradigm somehow figures out how to solve the problem, or it gets overthrown. And that overthrow? That's a scientific revolution. A revolution is a complete, as Kuhn says, tradition-shattering event. Einstein's theory of relativity didn't just add a footnote to Newton's laws, it proposed a fundamentally new way of looking at space and time and gravity. And it won because it could explain that weird orbit of Mercury and other anomalies that the old paradigm just couldn't handle. But here's where it gets really tricky. Kuhn argued that the people who believe in the old paradigm and the people who believe in the new one are, in a way, speaking different languages. He called them incommensurable. It means you can't just line them up and compare them on some neutral ground. They have different standards, they ask different questions, they even define basic words differently. And this famous quote from Max Planck really drives home how deep that divide is. Switching from one paradigm to another isn't usually a matter of pure logic or proof. A lot of the time, the older generation of scientists, they just can't make that leap. The revolution really takes hold when a new generation grows up learning the new paradigm from day one.
And all of this leads to what is probably Kuhn's most radical and honestly most fascinating claim, that a paradigm shift doesn't just change how scientists think, it changes what they actually see.
Yeah, you heard that right. Kuhn compared it to a gestalt switch. You know that famous illusion where you can see either a duck or a rabbit? The lines on the page don't change at all, but your brain can flip how it interprets them. First you see a duck and then, bam, you see a rabbit. You literally can't see both at the same time. Let's make this super concrete. An Aristotelian scientist looking at a swinging rock on a string saw an object that was being held back from its natural goal, to be at rest on the ground. Its motion was messy and it was dying out. But Galileo, working in a totally new paradigm, looked at the exact same object and saw a pendulum. He saw a body whose motion was regular, repeatable, something you could use to build a clock. Same object, completely different worlds. Kuhn had this great analogy for it. He said it's like what happens in those psychology experiments where people wear special glasses that flip the world upside down. At first, it's totally disorienting and chaotic, but after a while, something amazing happens. Their brain adapts, and their vision literally flips. The world looks right side up again. The scientist who converts to a new paradigm goes through that same kind of transformation. So when you put it all together, what Kuhn did was completely reframe our idea of scientific progress. It isn't this steady march toward some final capital T truth. Instead, it's a series of totally different worlds, each one built on the ruins of the last. It's a succession of brilliant but ultimately temporary ways of seeing reality. And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Kuhn's model was built to explain revolutions in science. But just think about it for a second. Where else do you see this pattern? These long, stable periods that are suddenly shattered by a radical shift in worldview that changes everything. In art? In politics? What about in our own personal beliefs? It's a really powerful way to think about how change happens, way beyond the walls of any lab.